if I like something, I really have to explain why I like it. And more than that, I have to explain what it is and what it does. So there's a lot of responsibility to it. In addition to which, you're dealing with people's careers. And so there is a kind of a social, I'm not a sociopath, I'm not about to destroy stuff. I'm really there to understand things and to evaluate things.
Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today, I'm very excited to speak with Joseph Giovannini. Joseph Giovannini has served as the architecture critic for New York Magazine and the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, and was a longtime staff writer on design and architecture for The New Yorker, Architectural Record, Architectural Digest, Art in America, Art Forum, Architecture Magazine, Architect Magazine, Industrial Design Magazine, and Interior Design. A prominent figure in American architecture, he has been an activist, critic, and a record of discovering emerging talent for major mainstream publications and professional journals. He coined the term deconstructivism during articles he wrote announcing the movement. Giovannini has written literally thousands of articles for periodicals, and he has also authored numerous essays for books and monographs. As a critic, he has won awards, grants, and honors. So this guy has critically thought about things that are intentionally going outside the established norm, the avant-garde, the disruptive. And to be able to do that, it's like you've got to get ahead of where they're going in a way to be able to critique what they're doing, which means that this guy's very forward-thinking, very thought out, very good writer, and very good perceptor and thinker, if that's, there's a better word for that, I'm sure, but I'm not finding it. So, very interesting conversation for me, and it was really great talking to him. I think you'll enjoy it as well. Give it up for Joseph Giovannini. Joseph Giovannini, welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and holding in there with us and figuring out all the technical difficulties. If nothing else, you're very persistent, and I appreciate that. So I am extremely interested in being able to get some of your time and to figure out how your mind works and how your experience has gotten you to the place that you're at as an architectural critic. You've worked as an architectural critic and an architectural journalist for quite some time, and you've produced a book that is massive. You have to strain when you pick it up, it's so big. And it's really, really interesting to look through. And I also love that there's a little hidden gem as far as like if you actually pay attention to this book, it's a little avant-garde in its own build. The angle is a little acute or obtuse, I forget which one exactly. But as you open the pages, you realize the book itself leaves traditional forms behind and goes a little crazy there, which is kind of a little Easter egg. So with your background, it seems that your value is in your abilities of critical perception of experience, critical thinking, and communication through written word. I'm deeply interested in your ability of critical perception and critical thinking process, and want to know how you work through this process.
I think I should say from the very beginning that I'm trained as an architect. Mm-hmm. So it gives me a very particular perspective on the architecture of other people.
Yeah, that's something we have in common there.
Yeah. And then on top of that, I was an English major at Yale, and I did a master's in French in Paris. And so I am trained to think through a thought logically and to write it down. So I have training in sort of both arenas, as my eye in architecture and my mind in terms of formulating thoughts.
Interesting.
I should also say that I enjoy writing a great deal. It's not that I always did, but I'm at a level where I can kind of plane and create a sentence that gives me some pleasure in its composition. So besides the critical acumen I might bring to the table, there's kind of a tool of writing as well as the tool of architecture. So it's a compounded expertise.
Yeah, the tool of writing is something that I play around with as a hobby, but I find that it gives me a huge amount of clarity once I've worked through it. It's a very valuable process that after you articulate something from a subjective experience into a articulated sentence or paragraph or article or book, the interesting thing you find is that in many ways that experience that you write from, you no longer hold it emotionally, but that you reference it in a more articulate manner. And you can reference, think to, and rationally pull meaning, contradictions, and things out of that experience that I found after you've been able to articulate it.
Well, I think articulating it also allows you to understand what you think, because you don't necessarily understand it until the articulation. So it's a tool of understanding as well. Frequently, the understanding emerges in the writing. I just finished a piece for the New York Times, and I didn't until after I submitted it did I actually realize that I had not really finished the point, and so I went back into the piece, and my editor accepted the addition that made a huge difference in the piece itself. So it's not as though you understand it completely in one fell swoop. The understanding is emergent.
So explain to me your process of understanding what you think, because I've had this struggle of I know what I feel, but I don't necessarily know what I think. And now there's this next level of now I need to understand what I think. How do you work through that whole process personally?
Well, it's not linear. You have to understand that with a building, frequently, if it happens to be a building that's in my orbit, I've probably seen it for a couple of years because it's under construction, and I might have been in contact with the architect in terms of the drawings and the planning and all that. So I've written about a number of buildings that have been gestating in my mind for a very long time. And frequently my opinions change, my emotions change, because things, a friend of mine wrote a book about art placement, and her thesis was that depending on the placement of work of art, like the Victory Samoth race, you see it very differently in different contexts. And in terms of your mind's eye, depending on how you're feeling, whether you've had your coffee, whether you're braced, whether you're kind of slow that morning, you think about things differently at different points. You see things differently in different contexts, and you think about things differently. When I read the same book that I've read maybe 2 years ago, I'm a different person, and so it's really a dynamic. It's a thought dynamic, it's a visual dynamic, and certainly it's an experience dynamic as well.
Interesting. So you, as an architectural critic, what is your process of approaching a designed, built project that you kind of onload that into your subjective experience and translate that into a critique of that work? Like, how does that process work for you?
Well, there are a number of layers. One is the historical layer. One is so that I'm extremely well traveled. I'm very architecturally literate, so I can put it in a historical context. There is also the context of my own writing as to whether I've written about this architect before or seen other comparable buildings. There's the context of, since I'm an architect, I mean, occasionally when I really have to slam a building because I think it's awful, I sit down at my drafting table and think, well, okay, I'm going to see if I can produce a better scheme myself as an architect, and so I kind of can check the quality of the scheme against my own kind of expertise. And if I think I can do better, then I have a better grounding in assessing the quality of the building. I don't always do that, but if I'm particularly disturbed at a building and I want to be fair to the architect, and so I kind of test it against other schemes that I can develop, spend a short amount of time on it. So there are a lot of levels to it, and those levels are also dynamic within them. And also, if I'm thinking about it over a period of time, then there's an additional time dynamism that. So it's really quite in flux. Do I come down on the same opinion twice over a period of time? Yes, but there would be nuanced changes. There's no hard rule for it. It's complex.
So how does one get to a point of actually being an architectural critic? There's no degree that you can get in school to specifically say, I've come out and I'm going to be a critic. It seems like you have these two educational backgrounds that simply created the environment for a person to be able to understand, process, but then turn that into an articulate written form. Is that a fair assessment of how you've gotten into that position?
I think, there's one's native predispositions, and then there's just the accidentalism of careers. I was always I went to architecture school at Harvard, and I was kind of the class writer. And if we wrote petitions against the faculty, which at that time we thought was mediocre, I was the one who was deputized to write. And as a result, I became the victim of the faculty, which didn't like the student opposition, and so my scholarship was stripped. Although I wasn't flunked out like some of my other. So I had years of student loan as a result to pay for my talents as a writer in this particular class. Anyway, yes, I like to think, and I like to think, and I like to talk about what I think. And so there's a natural predisposition which was cultivated by, 5 years at Yale as an English major, and then another year in Paris doing a master's in French, which gave me another level of expertise because of my French. I was able to read the French philosophes, the contemporary philosophes who are basically post-structuralists. So I would say that I have a multiple grounding. That said, I could have just been a happy-go-lucky architect blathering to my friends a lot, except that when I first started out as an architect, I was living in Venice, California, and I chanced on I walked through a gallery that a friend of mine owned, and she introduced me to a reporter from the Herald Examiner. And so Lainey said, Joseph, this is Camilla Snyder, who is doing an article for the Herald. She's a reporter. And Camilla, this is Joseph Giovannini. He's an architect. And Camilla turns to me and she said, well, how would you like to write the architecture criticism for the Herald Examiner? So that's where the point of contact was made between my career as a critic and my careers as an English literature person and my career as an architect. So it was a pure accident. And I said in response, well, yes, that would interest me, because I had in fact just written the introduction to what became a book called Los Angeles at 25 miles an hour. So so the Herald asked me for some writing submission. I had something, and then they tried me out with somebody else who didn't work out. But I did work out. So the thing I didn't anticipate was that since my columns appeared once a week, I quickly became better known as as a critic, because buildings metabolize over a much longer period of time. So when the phone rang, it was always to write another article or to write an introduction. And so my career as a critic galloped away while my career as an architect kind of stalemated. So when the phone rings now, it's still for criticism and it's not for architecture.
Do you get a different fulfillment, a different pleasure, a different thinking process when you're approaching something as a critic compared as a creative force as far as making a built project compared to the creative but critical instinct of judging or critiquing a project? How's the hat or the mindset that you wear in those situations different?
Well, they're comparable because when you're designing, you're also self-criticizing. And it's not as though by divine afflatus you a brilliant design lands on your desk. It might be a brilliant concept, and you have to work it out. And it's comparable with doing an article or a book. And of course, books and articles are very different. It's a whole different animal altogether. But it's the same, largely the same self-critical process. It's involved with thinking and ideas. It always starts with an idea. And then the ideas compound and you develop, and it's no longer the same idea at the end as it was at the beginning. It's developed and nuanced. But if it turns out that there's a good solution, either as an article or as a piece of design, as a building, is hugely gratifying, and there's a gratification at reaching some sort of resolution.
Now, as you set out as a critic, is there a temptation to be solely critical in the pejorative kind of way of saying it, that there's always look to, or is there a desire in that critic mindset to look at something and find simply what's wrong with it as a means of being someone who's hard to impress and naturally have more authority? Or like, what is the attitude and the emotional mindset when you approach a thing like that? Because my idea of a critic comes from Ratatouille. Are you familiar with that child's cartoon?
I saw the movie.
Yeah, and the food critic in that is my only personal interaction with a critic to this point, right? Like, if you want to say it that way. And it seems like an overly,
Well, I have a strong objection to people who simply say I like something and I dislike it without supporting it. I think a primary rule for a job of a critic is to explain. And the explanation also is a way of understanding it yourself or myself. So if I don't understand something, I really am loath to pronounce a yay or nay about something. You have to understand too that criticism is often mistaken as a negative critique. It's much harder to write a positive critique and sound reasonable, because you end up sounding as though you're flattering. To give a very positive review to something actually as an onus to the critic, or at least it does to me, it's extremely easy to come down on something, because for all the sort of homegrown critics that you read on the internet, they just throw stuff out, easy to do, and self-elevating. You're always superior because you're showing how bad something is. And so I don't, if I like something, I really have to explain why I like it. And more than that, I have to explain what it is and what it does. So there's a lot of responsibility to it. In addition to which, you're dealing with people's careers. And so there is a kind of a social. I'm not a sociopath. I'm not about to destroy stuff. I'm really there to understand things and to evaluate things. And some things are kind of gray that you come down on with a positive and a negative thing. Then if that's the case, you can't sound, nebbish. You can't sound as though on the one hand, but on the other, that's you can be a weak critic as well for not having an opinion. So I think the people like a strong argument, but they also like it very well written. I like to do what I would call tender explosions in a piece, little surprises along the way that gratify the reader in terms of just the pleasure of reading.
Mm. So would it be correct for me to take away from that a talented critic would be someone who can articulate their subjective experience into an opinion and be able to explain that opinion in a clear enough manner to be able to actually transfer that experience to someone else who could then go and experience that same built environment and understand what you're saying, both from the reading of it, but also find a cohesion in their experience after reading what you've read that rings true?
Well, experience can be objective as well as subjective.
Okay.
So it's not as though if one experiences something, one is just feeling it, one is also thinking it. So I think from the very beginning, they're both. Now I'm not saying that scientific objectivity is always possible, but it's certainly an ingredient in it. So there are a lot of people a lot of critics who don't use the I, but because they're purporting to be an objective critic. One critic I admire a great deal, who's unfortunately died, Herbert Muschamp of the New York Times, he would, rather than pretending to be a scientist in a white coat looking at a building, he would say, hey, I came to this city as a gay guy when I was a teenager, and it kind of unleashed me, it gave me a context in which I could become myself. And but the point is, he was saying from the outset, this is my identity, this is how I see the world, this is my filter, and therefore you should understand that my objectivity is to a certain extent subjected to my identity. So he goes on from there. So I think that's a very honest way of going about it. And in my book, I did the same thing because I'm trained as an architect. I do work, particularly lofts, and there's a section, maybe 20 pages into the book, where I felt I do an autobiography. I say, this is my background. I studied this and I wrote that, and this is the history of the book, and then on the last page, which is the spread, the graphic artist decided to put my design in the book. But the point is, this is who I am, this is how I see the work, and it's fairly congenial. I'm going to be a supporter of this work because I kind of believe in it in my own practice. This is who I am, this is how I see it. Now, I don't do that in articles. If I'm writing something for the New York Times or Architectural Record, I'm not showing my work, but I try to be ecumenical. There's stuff that I write about that I would never design, but I appreciate because in its own terms is very good, or maybe it might be bad in its own terms, but I don't. I try to think of it as independent of my own proclivities.
So I'd be interested in understanding your what you have as a foundational belief system that you stand on to then form opinions and determine for your own experience, what is good and bad from the foundation on up to everything? Is there a foundational belief system that you have of our reality that informs your opinion around these issues of design and art and everything?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Foundational. There are, I have a belief system, but I don't necessarily judge buildings by my own belief system. But let me tell you about my belief system. I believe in open form, open experience. I don't believe in boxes. I don't believe in symmetries. And you can make that into a political analogy. I think that if you're in a highly hierarchical and overly ordered environment, that it really directs you. It tells you how to think, how to behave, how to exist in a space. So what I'd like to do is to enable the person to kind of give agency to somebody's experience, so that people, rather than being told how to go through a building, how to experience it, can actually be intrigued through one's curiosity to discover it, so that the building in some way actualizes the senses and the mind and experience of the person. I was in of the person experiencing the building. So experiences, I like to give experience to a user, rather than telling a user what the experience should be. There's a building that I wrote about in a couple of places in the book. It's the cultural center in Azerbaijan, in Baku in Azerbaijan, and I compare it to a government building that was built during the Stalinist period, which is the four-poster building and it's a layered building. It's layered cake. It's about 7 or 8 stories, within which on the facade, there are all sorts of classicized elements. Well, everything has a rank in that building. It's very hierarchical from top to bottom. Everything has its place. In addition to which, there's a radiant control over the city, because it's placed at a center point in the city, and so roads radiate out from that. This is kind of a super Stalinist structure that tells you where you belong in society, what you should think, and it's really sort of an instrument of state control. So that to me is a bad building. From a philosophical point of view, I'm a Democrat. I believe in liberating people and not telling them what to think. So down the road, on the way to the highway, Zaha Hadid did a very free-form building that you might say looks like a floating handkerchief. And the inside the spaces are also, looks very levitated. You can't see a bolt that's securing anything. It's just kind of freedom itself in stone. It's actually not stone, but it's metaphorically stone. And the first time I visited, I was given a minder from the authoritarian government, and he still has a mentality that comes out of the first building. So as we're walking through it, he's telling me what to think. And it's so contradictory to the actual experience of the building, which is really a building you want to swim through on your own path and poke around. You can never see a terminal point because it's always hidden out of sight. There's no end to it. There's an infinity through which you walk. It's just really mesmerizing. And so I was courteous. I was a guest, and I thanked him for it. And can we walk through the same building again and let me just experience it in my own terms? And so he shut up. He was courteous, and I walked through it, and I had an entirely different experience. But it was not directed either by him, but more importantly, it was not directed by the building. The building sort of suggested the experience I would have. So yeah, there's a philosophical basis to what I think a good building should do. Notwithstanding, there's some buildings that, for example, there's a very quite brilliant, huge airport terminal in not Bombay, in is it Calcutta? No, it's in Delhi. I think it's Delhi, in India, done by SOM. And they were inspired by perfectly sublime pavilions, garden pavilions in northern India. And those are invariably symmetrical and somewhat predictable, but there's an ethereal aspect to it that, brings it into a different realm altogether. So these are buildings that are not open form. It's about closure because the corners are defined, the volumes are implied. Still, it's just, beautiful. You just, it gives you a different experience altogether. So I'm not applying my own standards to that because those are not the standards that they designed by, but they did a really inspired job in many of these pavilions. And the SOM architects took that idea and they inflated it into a huge structure. And I have to admire it. It's a little obvious because by the time you inflate something by, 40, a multiple of 40, and it's symmetrical, then it becomes a little monotonous, but still is better than what might have been done 40 or 50 years ago, just out of steel. This is, anyway, they really, and they also made it indigenous. So it was not a colonial imposition on India, but they derived a language from India. So it had things going for it. It was not as brilliant as Zaha's invention in Baku, because it's highly derivative, but it was derivative with a sensibility that gave it a quality that I admire. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying, and it sounds like you have a building type that fits your more psychological trait of openness towards reality, that when you experience it and it allows you to wander and have a unique experience no matter who you are in that building for your personality type. That's a very immersive experience of being encouraged to try this, try that, go here, see that. It's not dictated to you from an outside source of knowing, like you would in, say, a very regimented classical building with a grid layout, blah, blah, blah. But that at the same time, there's apparently a need and sometimes an ability to do those buildings in a beautiful way that even is inviting and pleasant for those who have a more open disposition to their surroundings. Is that a summary?
Yeah, that's quite true. In the first category, I would say that I try to avoid systems of control. And systems of control might be a grid or a perspective, it might be geometry, it might be Euclid, or it could be a air conditioning system that seals off an entire building that you can't open the window in it. There are lots of systems of control. Basically authoritarian structures. What else did I want to say about that? I was going to lead somewhere else.
We have our open disposition buildings and our more conscientious disposition buildings.
Yes. So, but what I find really uninteresting in building is when it's so obvious that there's nothing to discover, that you understand the layout from the very beginning, you understand the detailing. You can have a misdefined building that's Euclidean or in a box, but if it doesn't tell you everything in one shot, then I think that it has a potential of being immersive. That your curiosity leads you through the building. You wonder what's happening. It doesn't tell you what it's doing. It's not overly explicit. It again, connects with you. It connects through your imagination, basically.
So let me see if I can share an idea and make any sense of it. So this is an infant idea that I don't know that I'll be able to articulate clearly, and I may just confuse you. But you're a critic, so you'll be able to somewhat like tell me where I'm going off the rails, maybe. But
Yeah.
as a personality type, I have a much more open disposition. If I have a normal or a consistent job, or if I have a consistent paycheck, or if anything in my life is too repetitive or not surprising or dependable, to some degree, I become bored, I become claustrophobic feeling, or you name it. I'm always looking for surprises and changes and new experiences in my life. And it sounds like you have the same desire for when you're interacting with a building, that it's something that you don't necessarily know the entirety of the building from the facade and know that, XYZ, you come in, you go there, and it's dictated and it's, But at the same time, I know there's people that are of more of a disposition that want to know their boundaries and expectations in certain areas of their life right from the start, so they don't have to process those experiences at a higher level. And generally, more conscientious people I have found, and this is my own idea, that when they interact with the space, they like a more regimented expectation that's not going to surprise them, that they don't have to work through figuring out.
I think sometimes you go into a building and you want to get to your dentist's office, and you don't really want an experience. You just want to get there. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you don't want a promenade. You just want to get from A to B, from the entrance. That doesn't mean the building can't be interesting. You see things peripherally, so you can experience things in a subliminal way. But even if you're being even about it, so I'm wrong with efficiency. I have to say that these buildings have to work, and I'm not a functionalist to the extent that functionalism to me is not necessarily the be all and end all of the building. I think that we have lived through decades of an impoverished environment, because functionalism alone has determined how buildings are built and how they behave and how they're designed. There has to be more than that. The book Functionalism is itself an ordering system that can be quite crushing. However, if it's functional and poetic and intriguing and open and emotional, then you start having a richer environment.
Okay, that helps me understand that a bit more.
So there are multiple ways of experiencing it. You can therefore experience it emotionally, or through your curiosity, or as discovery, or as efficiency.
Mm-hmm. For me, let's see, is it MoMA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston? Have you been to that building on the south side of Boston there?
Yes, yeah. I have, quite a long time ago when it opened. I was there for everything.
But the way that you explained the building, the Zaha Hadid building that you experienced with the government-appointed guide, I remember going through that building and feeling that I don't know where I'm supposed to go here next. And I was expecting a building type to tell me that. But if I knew ahead of time that this building was designed, and this was, probably 15 years ago, and it was an interesting experience that now that I know that, and I've heard you say that, I'd like to go back and just simply let myself wander and see how that building actually handles me. I think that would be an interesting experience now.
Well, it's an interesting comparison, because in Zaha's building, there are is an unfolding promenade. At the ICA, particularly on the ground floor, it's not very inflected. I don't. I think it's so open that it doesn't have much suggestion to it. I wouldn't say that I was intrigued. The building intrigued me through the whole thing. However, there were moments of discovery, and revelation. For example, in the auditorium, it faces out to the water, so you discover the bay. The scale of the building is scaled to the ocean. It's a really big scale there on the waterfront. There's a surprise in the auditorium that's where the geometry contradicts itself. So you don't know which is up or not. Anyway, so that's a building that's kind of conceptual, and there's an intrigue to it. It's not particularly visual. It's very cerebral. They're really conceptual artists rather than kind of experiential artists. You don't look at the building to get it. You kind of think of it and get it. It's a different level altogether. Yeah. They were very influenced by Marcel Duchamp, the artist who believed that art had become too retinal and not cerebral enough, and so he textualized his art, frequently writing text, so there's a narrative, and so you could say that this is a building with a kind of a textual narrative that's conceptual. It's so I think it's quite valid, and it's a different form of experience is multiple, and conceptual experience is another form of experience.
Yeah, there's definitely a challenge to that building for me in its experience.
Yeah. That said, you could say, I never wrote about the building, but I know that I thought that Liz Diller and Rick Scovidio make a point of not developing a vocabulary. And so that's interesting insofar as all their buildings are different than each other, but it's not so great because when that means they don't build on what they already learned on the last project, particularly. Frank Gehry is somebody who kind of masticates forms over a period of buildings. And so he learns through the vocabulary that he develops. That's also true of Zaha Hadid. So I think that had they been building on previous discoveries, it might have been a better building. I like the building, but I think that it is not as seasoned as it might have been had they developed a vocabulary that was quite promising. Somebody like Richard Meyer invented vocabulary very early, and he never evolved it. So fortunately, it was a very rich vocabulary, but by the end, he was really repeating himself. And so his career is eventually disappointing because he didn't discover new paths. He just reiterated what he already knew.
I would like to delve into a little bit of your understanding of the depth of the creative process, like as much as you've thought about it, how the creative process actually works from a need or desire for some creative thing or work of art or project, architecture project, anything, the creative process from beginning to acceptance or rejection. Do you have a formative picture of that in your mind, or an emotional process that you can explain through the entirety of that and the different parts of psychology and society that work together in both creation and then accepting of that creation into societal norms?
Architecture is a field with a process that is different than the more individualized creative process of say, writing. So let's take a firm that's medium size or maybe even large. So you have a firm that has a lot of people, maybe a couple hundred people, and you have a number of projects coming in. And let's say it's headed by one person. It could be Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid. What's frequently the case is that it's collaborative. Actually, it's not individual. It's not a genius sitting down at a table. It might be the head of a firm that sketches a general idea, or it could be that in a writing room in a political comedy or a late night show, that you have 8 or 10 people sitting around a table, and they start talking about, they kick around some jokes, and the skit develops out of this creative collaboration. So in architecture, the collaboration is hugely important, because even if an architect establishes the basic partie, which would be the basic design, it then goes to somebody else or a group of people who are going to develop it, and it's incumbent on the architect hiring other people to hire the best staffs possible, because their contributions are really additive and hugely important in the whole thing. So you have compounded creative process. Is compounded by a number of voices who are contributing. Now that process is very different from a writer, obviously, and that's kind of much more individual. It's a single mind under a pool of light, and it's interesting to get into the flow, because you might start with a sentence, or you might block the whole thing out in an outline. There's some there's one colorist who told me that the way she develops color is to start with, say, one color, and she wants to go to a final color. So she tries to figure out how to get from orange to purple, and she might go through green. And so the same thing is true of some writers. You might know what the ending is, might know what the beginning is, as you plot out it. So in between. So I think the process of discovery is hugely important, and there are 2 levels of discovery. One is the thought discovery of if you're getting from A to Z, what the M is going to be and what the N is going to be, in that, if it's a linear narrative. But there's also the discovery of words in the meantime, which are the art of writing. I don't really think that you can be an interesting creative writer unless you're creative with words. And I had worked for Harold Bloom at Yale, who wrote, he was a very prolific writer, and he just wrote whatever he was very logical, and he knew what he wanted to say, but there was no discovery in what he was writing. He just wrote it flat out, and he didn't recapitulate. If you've looked at James Joyce's manuscripts, those are kind of really chaotic manuscripts where he's crossing out and he's doing arrows here and there. It's as though he's writing and rewriting and overwriting it. So that's a whole different process. But I would say that discovery is the most important thing in the creative process. Of you don't know where you're going to go or how are you going to say it. That's true of a design as well. That you if you know where you're going to go, then it's not creative at all. You're just executing a design that has this DNA all set out for you. So discovery is hugely important. That's also the pleasure of designing or writing, that these little kind of exclamation points of discovery are very rewarding. That's the pleasure in it.
Right.
And if you're not taking some form of pleasure, then it's probably not going to be pleasurable for the reader or the person experiencing a building.
I've found the most insight I have had in the things that I've attempted to write about. The most progress and insight I have come while I'm extremely emotional. If I can allow that emotion to interact with my articulate mind, if I can just almost separate the two and let the articulate mind listen to the emotions.
Kind of emotions in architecture are curious. I think that you're dealing with space and form, and buildings certainly can be emotional. Forms and spaces can be emotional, but I find that most architects are interested in the visual aspect of a building. And so if it looks cool or inventive or unexpected, those are emotions, but of a type that's different than the 19th century idea of emotionalism being, stormy weather and, stormy temperament, or is a probably a cooler emotion. It's still emotional. When I write, I suppose I like wit, I like delight. That's an emotional thing, but I'm not necessarily looking to cry. Although when I see a movie that has a strong emotional content, I'm perfectly prepared to cry a great deal at movies. It depends. It depends on what you mean by emotion, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the time I'm working through things writing that usually have to do with belief. And so there's a lot entangled up in belief that then you have to process and work through. So that's probably why I'm getting further in those instances if I allow the emotions that are probably very much I probably protect myself from those with some of the things I predispose the direction that my mind should go in questioning some of the things that bring me emotional comfort, I'd imagine. So
are you talking philosophical belief or religious belief, or?
They're one and the same for me, and to a large degree. I don't know how to quite separate them at this point personally, and in the both creative writing and working through process, I find that if I can allow myself to be emotional while thinking, that the two together sharpen each other.
Sure, it's an interesting layering that's going on.
Yeah, and I don't know how to control it, but if I listen to music that is emotional for me, either in a positive or melancholy or any way, that ability to let those emotions flow and encourage them to flow within me while being highly articulate with my mind, that's when the combination of those two produces insight for me.
You and I then have different writing experiences. I don't try to infuse my emotions in the writing. The emotions come out of the writing. The pleasure of a thought, or the gratification of something's well articulated. I'm not writing biographical stuff, and I'm not writing fiction. I have done a number of profiles recently for the New York Times, and as soon as this is a huge difference then between I'm writing about things normally, And what I found in these profiles that I've done is very liberative because I can deal with people who have had emotional lives and whose biographies have trajectories that are not always happy or might be happy, and at that point I can as a by empathy I can inject an emotion that might correspond to their emotion. So by writing about people, I found that the notion of emotion is more salient. When I was an undergraduate, when I was a high school student, I was a very happy kid, and I was a student body president, and I liked people. I was very chatty and all that. For some reason, when I went to Yale, I became really introverted. I left California, and I was in the East Coast context. I didn't have many givens to bring me out. So I became quite self-isolated. I wasn't unhappy, but I didn't connect to a lot of other people or a lot of different activities. So, and I was an English major, and that introverted me all the more, so that by the time I was it was compounded by the young ladies I went out with, and particularly one in particular with whom I fell quite in love, and she turned out to be a quite sad woman who eventually committed suicide. So by the time I finished college, I was so introverted that I couldn't play a game of charades. Because I was shy and I was a complete opposite from the student body president I had been in high school. In California, I played tennis and basketball. I didn't do any sports, and there was nothing to. So I thought, this has got to stop. I am no longer happy with myself, and I had always been interested in looking at architecture, and my father had been a contractor, and so I had a certain background in building, and I thought, well, if I focus on objects that are outside of myself, maybe I can lift myself out of myself. Well, it turned out to work, and so I made a career out of architecture and writing about architecture. So I no longer am as inverted, not nearly as introverted as I was. I'm somewhat introverted, but I'm more extroverted now. So by objectifying the subjects I think about, rather than subjectifying it, this meant that emotional part of my life was better controlled. Let's say I had lost control.
That's very interesting. So it also seems to me that the creative process of that part of discovery is one of objectifying your subjective experience to be able to pass on to others. Is that a fair way of saying that, in your opinion?
Well, it's not objectifying the subjective. Because I think that both the experience is simultaneously subjective and objective. So I wouldn't say that one is applied to the other. I would say they merge at the same time and they're intertwined, and they prod each other.
Right, but the creation that comes out of that creative process, be it writing, architecture, art, music, is in some form an objectification, a new objectification from someone's experience. That's what I'm trying to say. Does that ring true to you at all, or no?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it evolves out of that experience.
Okay. All right. So
I could say though too that the end result can be simultaneously subjective and objective. So you could say that it's a subjectification of the experience, the initial experience, as well as the objectification. Except that you're saying that the product itself is an object. It's a piece of writing or building.
Right. It does become something that is of further utility that came out of the chaotic abstract into some form of further utility that is closer to an objectification, that even though art is, a subjective interpretation most of the time, it is somewhat of a further objectification of someone's experience that then someone else has to in some way subjectify, interact with it, and come away with their own experience. But they have created an objectified thing out of their subjective experience, it seems.
Mhm. I think that's fair.
So there's an interesting, to me, what seems like maybe a paradox. I'm not sure how to hold this and think about it. But when you come to giving a critique of something that is deconstructive, avant-garde, how does one critique something like that? Because if something is deconstructive and avant-garde, by definition, if I'm understanding everything correctly, that thing is created as a reaction of breaking away and intentionally doing something that is not of the established order, doing something new. And so how do you judge that as something that you're creating a critique of it that you can pass on in written form to someone else to help them form an opinion on that thing, which is deconstructive and avant-garde, that is still this subjective interpretation? It can only be a subjective interpretation that the critic is creating around that thing, because it is not of an established form that you can then reference, like the guide to classical architecture, and say, well, this isn't a good piece of classical architecture because of X, Y, Z. How do you critique something that is deconstructive and avant-garde?
Well, it is not raw chaos, although it might be inspired by raw chaos. As we know from James Glick's book and all the research that went in by a lot of other science, the chaosticians, there's an order to chaos that's not really chaotic in the sense that we usually mean. If it's ordered, if the chaos is ordered, then it's not completely chaotic, and it's certainly not random. When I reviewed the Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Bilbao, I realized that the building had greater affinities with the mountains that surround the city of Bilbao and the cloudscape and even the river in front than it did, which is very liquid and flowing, and than it did with the architecture in the surroundings. So that basically the what we are calling deconstructed architecture, and which might have, as a group of buildings, been inspired by chaos science, is immersive. It's nonlinear, basically. So it doesn't mean that the nonlinearity makes it random or arbitrary. It takes a huge amount of skill. I once did an apartment in New York renovation, and this was in 88, 89. And I had just recently gotten involved in this movement, and I found that this apartment wanted two languages. It wanted a deconstructivist language, but it also wanted a classical language, because it was one of the grand buildings on Gramercy Park. It was duplex, and it had been owned by a family that invented shorthand writing. And it's been in the family for a long time. So there's molding all the way around, and it was, but it was stuffy. It was very kind of unpleasant. It hadn't been alive in decades, and so, but I wanted to respect the framework, and so I actually extended the moldings. I redeployed them, and then I injected a storm that went throughout the whole thing. All these floating planes. I had I had to show the plans to the building board, and so I basically showed them alive by showing the basic layout, which is all orthogonal, but the real architecture occurred in mid-air, where I had these floating planes that were going through the whole thing and piercing the floor. It was widely published. It was internationally published about 8 or 9 places. But my discovery was that it was so much easier to do the classical molding because everything had an order. It was just, it kind of wrote itself, if you were. And it was far more difficult to invent my apparently chaotic storm, because the angles all have to be determined, and they have to work with each other. They have to work functionally, and so on. It's not as though this kind of architecture is at all easy, and it sometimes fails. You have to be very good at it, and it's not for everybody. And some people just frankly don't like it. When I go to a barber, and let's say I have a new barber, I always tell him, just don't make me look like a Republican. And by that, I mean, I don't want every hair in place. I don't want to tell him what to do. I just want a certain wildness to it. So certain wildness, a controlled wildness, is something I look for, because it means that you simply are freer. You're more reactive. You're just more open to the world, and you don't want to control things. You want to nail everything down.
So you have a very psychologically open disposition in many ways, like myself, I believe, from what little conversation we've had. What's your understanding and allowance for the polar opposite of you? That there's those people who would sit down at the barber and say, make it short on the sides, this on the top, curly here, don't make me look like a Democrat, right? Like, what do you give to that that disposition, that different disposition? Like, when people say you shouldn't change a person, to me, that's what's being said. Someone's born conservative or conscientious in general, or they're born open in general. And to try and put, someone like yourself or like me into a regimented system where you know what's coming for the next however long, and you can expect things, it's very disheartening and uncomfortable and constraining. But to take that conscientious person and put them in that same environment, they can thrive because they know what to expect, and they can get on with the organization and the management and the maintenance of all the things that do give us a place to recuperate and regain our energy to go back out into the chaos. How do you relate to that other half of the dispersion of our, if that's the right word, disbursement of our base psychological traits?
Well, there are, it depends on whether somebody who's highly self-controlled is also controlling, so that it's one thing to be self-controlled, the other thing is to be authoritarian. Now, right. The minder who walked me through the building in Baku was, I was polite, and I endured the 45 minutes of what I was told what to think. Right. But he didn't acknowledge who I was and what my feelings might be and what my thoughts would be. He didn't let me. Had he just served me for information that might have been interesting or not, like the number of tons of steel and how the space frame was fabricated, and that might have been of some interest in, because I didn't know. You can always absorb information, but he was basically telling me how to experience the building. That building itself was built in a fairly authoritarian culture, because the guy who runs the country, after whom the building is named, is an autocrat. Mm-hmm. And what Hadid was doing basically was building a subversive building that showed another way of thinking and being. And so maybe this minder, if he goes through the building long enough, might relax his speech to open his eyes and actually experience it. So the building might be seditious. It might actually open his thought system up to other ways of thinking. I saw Ron DeSantis approach a group of about 8 or 10 minority kids. They were young men, maybe 18 to 20, or maybe 16 to 19.
And this is the governor of Florida, right? Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
So yes, that's right. So each of these kids, all of the minorities, had masks on. And DeSantis, of course, his political position is freedom. You're not supposed to wear masks. You're not supposed to be told that you have to wear a mask. So he gets up on the stage, and he tells them tells them all to take off their masks. So here's a guy whose political stand is you should be able to choose whether or not to wear masks, and he's telling them what to do. And when he tells them that, he doesn't engage them. He doesn't say, how are you? What high school do you go to? And what are your products? He doesn't engage them. They're just they're wallpapered for his speech. And he wants the politically correct wallpaper so that they can't do the mass. This is an authoritarian. And had Obama gone up to the stage with the same guys, Obama would have made a connection. He would have said, hi, what's your name? What you're going to college, or what are your prospects, or he would have engaged them in some. He would have personalized it. So DeSantis was just there to tell them what to do. I have no patience for that at all. And he wants to run a government that way. He wants to be president of the United States. He wants to dictate the way we should be. This is not what I would consider democratic. So if he is, he has a Republican haircut. Oh, he went to the same schools I went to, Yale and Harvard. But we came out with entirely different points of view. I went to architecture school. He went into law, which can be controlling if you depend on your application of it. So it's a different mentality. I think he has an Italian background. I have an Italian background as well. So there's certain parallels, but we're entirely different personality types. He hates my personality type. I hate his personality type, and I hate it because he tries to control other people to tell them what to think. He's a minder. He's a social minder.
Now, if he had gotten up in that situation and said, each one of you is free to not wear those masks if you want, or to wear them, it's your choice, and that's what I stand for. To me, that's the middle of the road sentiment, to be able to say, I don't know how I could relate that to your guide at the Zaha Hadid building, but if your guide had simply told you the information and let you make up your own decision, that would not have been authoritarian. So if that governor DeSantis had been able to get up there and say, the information in my interpretation says this, which then makes me want to form laws to say, you get to make up your own mind on this and determine your own path forward, and you get to discover that, that's less authoritarian. And it seems like...
Yeah, there's that, yes, but initially he has to treat them as human beings. He has to engage them. They're not props. So they were, for him, props. They were wallpaper. the premise of it was you know, I'm going to use these people. You know, that's not a good thing. And then okay, so let's say he did engage them by acknowledging the fact that they have their own minds, and said, oh, this is kind of funny because I'm not wearing the mask and you're all wearing masks, and I think that, you know, he might have actually caught the moment. That would be somewhat artful. It would be reacting to a situation, kind of improvising, being alive. But he came with an agenda that was very rigid. You know, that's Stalin, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, you know, it's a expression that is one of like almost killing life when you say, oh, that looks like Soviet era architecture. It's just heavy and I don't know. The you can always there's some project buildings to the north of New York City every time I go in that to me just reek of authoritarian Soviet era architecture that just feels controlled and oppressive. And that kind of thing, I don't get any comfort. Although when I get extremely overwhelmed, I find myself daydreaming what it would be like to actually be in the military, to where I didn't have to think about any possibilities and I only could just relax and be and do what I'm told. And I know as soon as I was in that situation, I'd get really itchy really fast. But at those times when I'm exhausted from all the options, at some point that does also comfort me, which is odd. I don't know how to hold that really, but.
Yeah, no, I think that there's some personality types that want to surrender to be told what to do. A friend of mine has a sister it's a Jewish family, but it was kind of very Reformed Judaism. But one sister she was probably the very bright one in the family, National Merit Scholar, and she went to Yale and the drama school, and she was kind of the bright light. For some reason, she gave all that up, and she married a Hasidic Jew, which means that all the liberalism of her background. Her father was the mayor of Miami, and she had every advantage. She liked being told what to do. She just it was a very confined situation, and if you surrender to that, then you know, I suppose there's a great comfort in knowing that you belong to a system that is in some way taking care of you. You don't have to take any initiative because the initiative need not apply. And I think you used the word, I had used the word wildness or wild, and you use the word life. And I suppose it all boils down to finding the life in a manuscript, finding the life in the building, giving that life to the user, to the reader, to the person experiencing it. So life rather than nailing things down. I mean, that's what I strive for in my work. And it's what I look for in other work.
So to round this out, to not take all of your day, what would you say are the primary differences or psychological traits that would make for a really great architect compared to a really great critic? What are the different aspects of the person that cause that that means of making a livelihood and approaching these different things in that the same thing essentially in those different manners, in those different processes? What distinguishes that? And is it something that if you're a great critic, you're automatically a great architect? And if you're a great architect, you're automatically a great critic? Does that line up? And what are the tendencies or personality traits or talents that distinguish those?
Well, I think openness would be sort of mental emotional openness would be critical for critic and for architect. The big difference is where when it's talent slide, you can be very open-minded, creative, and etc., but not have a good visual or spatial instinct. So there's some people who just don't have that particular talent, and conversely, somebody with those talents might not have a verbal talent. So there is germane to each endeavor kind of a skill set that is not necessarily transportable. It's not, if you're you just might, and there's some people who are good in both, whose left and right hemispheres talk to each other with great frequency and are collaborative, and so they can be both. But being verbal and visual are not necessarily coincident. But I think in terms of temperament, there's a great overlap in terms of curiosity and willingness to explore, to invent, to acknowledge, to enjoy not knowing, and to enjoy the kind of the path to knowing, or the path to inventing. Explorers in their medium.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time to field and help me become slightly less ignorant in all these areas. I really appreciate the opportunity to pick your brain. And I really appreciate the work you've put into this book. I have not made it through the entire book yet, or even come close, because it's 800 and some pages, isn't it?
Well, it turns out you can read it in sections. You can dip into it and leave it and then come back to it, because it's it's not like a narrative with from A to Z. I wrote it as a collage of themes, and so you can dip into it, and there are a lot of sections that are kind of self-sufficient, let's say.
Yeah. And I am really enjoying having this at home for the moments that are quiet, where I get to actually digest this kind of thing. And I would recommend this book to anyone, Architecture Unbound, A Century of the Disruptive Avant-Garde by Joseph Giovannini. Really great reference for, I think, kind of understanding architecture outside of the rigid mindset that I have so often found myself interacting with. Because as you've said, I think architecture that is disruptive and avant-garde is much more difficult and much more likely to fail. But when it's done right, it's received, and it changes the fabric going forward, in my opinion. And it's much harder, but when it's done successfully, it changes the future. And I really appreciate the work of this. And thanks for doing it. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, it's clear that you have an open mind and an open heart, so that's a huge advantage going forward.
It's the beginning of the end of absolute ignorance for me. So, right? I can admit I don't know a lot of stuff, and I've gotten a lot of stuff wrong. So it's a great starting point. So.
Okay. Well, lovely meeting you, if only over the Zoom.
Yes. Thank you so much, and let's do this again in a while when you put out another masterwork here. Good Lord.
Great.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much for your time.